5 former senior Korean government officials talking about expectations for U.S.-Korea relations in a new administration. And now we have the rollout of our 5th annual KEI YouGov survey of the American public on foreign affairs and issues in U.S.-Korea relations. I also want to mention a few upcoming things that are going on. First, we have an upcoming program we're co-sponsoring at the World Affairs Council in Columbia, South Carolina next week. I'm going to be going down for that. I'm very excited about it because South Carolina, Columbia was the home of former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Dixie Walker. He was our longest serving U.S. ambassador in Seoul. And also his experiences are featured in a new publication that we have called U.S.-Korean Diplomatic Crossroads. And that is a compilation mostly of first-hand recollections, individually and policy-wise, of serving ambassadors, along with historical accounts for those who were unable to write. And so that is a new publication that we're going to be rolling out later with some kind of event featuring some of the writers for that publication. I also want to mention our latest volume of our flagship Korea Policy Journal is coming out later this year. But prior to that, you can get a sneak peek on some of the contents by watching an author workshop and other Korea-related activities that are going to be occurring in UT Austin, October 23rd and 24th. The workshop will be streamed on our YouTube channel. And we'll be having other panels here focused on some individual chapters for that volume. The volume is going to be covering U.S.-Korea cooperation in critical and emerging technologies, including issues like quantum mechanics, semiconductors, cybersecurity, biotech, space, et cetera. Today, very happy that we're going to be able to examine American public support for the alliance in our KEI YouGov survey. This obviously it comes less than very shortly in advance of our U.S. presidential election. We have an excellent group to lead that discussion, and I just want to thank our panelists and introduce our panelists. Before I turn over the discussion, we have our own Andy Hong, program officer at KEI, who's going to be leading it, together with our interim director, James Kim, who has had long experience with public opinion analysis, previously on the Korean side of the relationship, but has come in since August to lead the U.S. side on our YouGov KEI poll. And we also have Dina Smeltz, who I've known for a long time, known on X as @RoguePollster. She's the Vice President of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy for over a decade at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And the poll that Chicago Council has been running, I think, is really the most comprehensive and long-running poll really looking at American foreign policy, American attitudes toward U.S. foreign policy. And she previously was also Director of Research in the Intelligence and Research Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. So very glad to have you, and I want to turn the panel over to you, Andy. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your gracious introduction, Scott, and good morning to all of you here in the audience this morning and to all of our virtual audience. My name is Andy Hong, Program Officer here at KEI, and welcome again to our launch of our 5th annual KEI YouGov Public Opinion Poll. I'd like to remind the audience that this is going to be a review of just some excerpts, and we're really excited to launch the full report available on our website at keia.org. Which we will be sure to link in the chat box right now for the live stream, as well as the video description once the event is complete and the report is launched. We hope to open the discussion following a brief moderated section going through some of these slides. We'll try to spend the final 15, 20 minutes on an audience Q&A. So once we reach the audience Q&A session, please feel free to raise your hand and an audience mic will be made available to you. For our online viewers, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box and our colleague will convey those questions to us. I think now that we have the logistics out of the way, I think we can turn to some of the more fun parts. Dina, James, thank you again for your time this morning. I'd like to start us off with some overall takeaways. So James, what do you think were the most important takeaways from this year's survey, if you could give us the bottom line?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. But before I answer your question, I do want to sort of make a couple of notes. I've only been here 2 months now at KEI, and one of my good friends at the office that I share asked, you know, what do you like about your job? And I said, well, one of the nice perks of job in this space is that I get to meet, you know, wonderful people and some extraordinary places and get to do some really amazing things. And this project, I think, is one of them, and KEI also fits the bill in the 2 months that I've been here. So I've been very, should I say, very blessed to have been able to be part of this project. I think the credit should go out to Kathy Stevens, was a former president of KEI, and also Troy Stangarone, who started this 5 years ago. Had the foresight to see that I was going to be doing this 5 years later and reviewing some of these very important data that I think is going to be quite interesting for discussion today. And had some really, really good feedback, not only from the input that you put into this, Andy and Jennifer and Scott, but also comments and feedback from our own Bill Brown and Clint Work, as well as Katie Dietrich and the YouGov team. And then, of course, last but not the least, Dina, who's with us today. So I really appreciate that, and I think this was a joint effort on part of everyone, and also the importance of the institutional history behind this survey, I think, is important to highlight. So as Scott had said, that I've been doing this on the Korean side, and Korean population, I mentioned to Dina yesterday in our short meeting, is different than the US. It's quite obvious, right? A bit more homogeneous ethnically and culturally. Not a bit more, but just homogeneous, relatively speaking. And also not the same kind of history and kinds of experiences that the Americans bring to this. So this was a very interesting look. I've been following Dina's work in this space for some time now. So I really admire her work, and the fact that we are here today after collaborating with each other over by email in 2019, I believe. And this is our first face-to-face get-together, right? So this is like almost like a pen pal getting together after 5 years. So this event is very meaningful to me and personally in many different ways. And let's get into the data. So I just want to highlight just the basic top line numbers here. There's obviously more to sift through if you take a look at the data. The report includes all of the questions with the initial distributions in the appendix, and we will be exploring other parts of the data, and more materials will be coming out in the coming weeks. And I know Andy's working on some things related to the culture of Korea, cultures and businesses, Americans' views about Korean culture and Korean businesses. So that should be an interesting one to look for. And then we'll also be looking at some other security-related issues, and I think Clint might be involved in that project as well. So I'm looking forward to collaborating more and trying to squeeze more out of this data. But let's take a look at the data that we see. So the first thing that we saw very interestingly enough, is that even though there's a lot going on in the world today right now in the Middle East and also in Ukraine, Americans are generally, focused on Asia. So as you can see here, even though China and Russia is an overriding concern, North Korea comes in third, and that hasn't changed over time. And this is true even after 2022. So I think this is very, very meaningful that there is a focus on East Asia. Obviously, the nuclear issue is very important for the American public. And so there's, bound to be broad, robust support for U.S. troop presence on the Korean Peninsula, as we can see here. About 64% of Americans basically support maintaining the current troop level or increasing it. It's interesting that in light of this, that we had the SMA negotiation completed last week, and it locks the two countries in for several years from here on out. So, this is, this is another point to be made. Even if North Korea gives up nuclear weapons, it seems to me that the Americans would still support, at least majority of the Americans, or close to a majority of the Americans would support maintaining or increasing the current troop level. This is partly because of North Korea, but there is also a broader strategic reason for this, right? And this slide basically shows it. 68% of the Americans believe that the U.S. alliance with South Korea is in the interest of the United States. And they understand that this goes beyond simply nuclear North Korea. And this is probably, also linked to sort of the American public's opinion about South Korea in general, broadly favorable. That hasn't changed, just as much as it is unfavorable for North Korea. Also, very good, results on trade. I think that a lot of Americans, 68% that we polled this year, see that engaging in trade with South Korea is beneficial to the United States. So even though there's a lot happening and we're hearing about, polarization in American politics, and the sound bites on this, vary, and I know there's a lot of concern in Seoul about this year's election. It seems to me that from the American public's perspective, the bilateral relations is fairly positive. And they're very optimistic about its future outlook on many levels, right? So but that's not to say that there's no difference. There is some difference if you turn, and take a look at how the Republicans and the Democrats see some of these issues on things like China, relative importance of Russia. There are some differences, but all in all, it's majority support that's across the board here. Majority focus on China, on Russia, and then followed closely by North Korea as a third most important concern. Minor differences on the relative emphasis on trade and the alliance. But it's over 50%. It's a supermajority for both sides. And nearly equal level of support for either increasing or maintaining the current troop level in South Korea. Yes, we are seeing some differences here on the relative emphasis that maybe each party places on what areas they would like to see the two countries focus on. So it seems to me that the Democrats here, so anybody who's self-identified Democrat in our poll, 90% of them are supporting Kamala Harris. And self-identified Republicans, 90% are supporting Donald Trump in our poll. So it's generally, it's along partisan lines. And here we see pretty even interest on things like, global health and climate change and human rights, just as much as there is on economy, technology, and regional security for the Democrats. But for the Republicans, it seems to me that there's a bit more emphasis on the regional security and the economy and technology, a bit less on the non-traditional security area. So that you could say is a bit of a difference, but I think all in all, it doesn't really change the way that the American people are looking at the bilateral relationship, the overall mood of the alliance. I think there's a general support for this particular relationship. So bottom line, looking good regardless of what happens, 3 weeks from now in the U.S. election. So what I would tell the Koreans is don't worry so much, or worry later after the election, not yet.
Thank you for that, James. I think it really hit home when you mentioned it's 3 weeks out. I think that really put it into perspective and how I think it's important for us to be talking about some of these issues today. And Scott mentioned earlier, and we discussed this, that you've been doing this from the Korean side for a very long time, and I really want to come back to maybe some differences and similarities you may have tracked in the Korean views from the opposite side for some of the same questions that you may have observed. But before we get to that, I mean, Scott also noted that CCGA, the Chicago Council, has been running these polls for a very long time. And I'm sure you saw from the very first slide, Dina, that this is our 5th annual one. So we'd really be happy to draw on some of your expertise and kind of look at, what do you see? If you could provide some more context from a longer time period, looking at our data and see, where things align and what's some notable things you observed were.
Okay, sure, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today, James and Scott. I have relied on Scott's analysis of poll numbers to put into a policy perspective for a long time now, and always appreciate his take on data and how it fits into policy questions. And James, it's just great to work with you again, and have enjoyed your working with you before when you were with us on. So yeah, I was going to just talk about putting these views into a broader context, because not only does the Chicago Council cover a lot of different foreign policy topics in the same survey, but we've also been conducting these surveys since 1974, so you can really look back on opinion and how it's shifted and changed over times and through different administrations. And thank you. One thing that I would definitely point out is that it has been a time of turmoil for Americans in the world. It's definitely taking a toll on their view of how engaged the United States should be in the world. And the fact that these numbers that James presented, but also our own numbers on Korea, which are very similar to KEI's numbers, they show steady and consistent support for the bilateral relationship and bipartisan support, which is changing a lot on foreign policy and isn't always the case anymore. So these are two really important trends in the relationship itself that I think are longstanding and stand to bode well as things get rocky as the year goes on. So let me just show you a quick, this is our barometer of U.S. engagement, support, American public support for the U.S. being involved in the world. This one I just truncated to 2015, but you can see the black line is the overall number. The blue line is how Democrats describe their views. The red line is Republicans, and the yellow is independents. So 56% now support an active U.S. engagement. So you see it's a low point here. When you look back all the way to 1974, this is the second lowest ever. In 1982, it was 54%. That's the only time when it was this low, besides 2023. So we've seen a steady decline kind of since 2020 on this. Two things. One is that it's low now because we see a correlation between declining support for U.S. military and economic assistance to Ukraine, which is mostly Republicans and independents falling. Democrats are still pretty firm on that. And also Israel has complicated the picture, and U.S. support for Israel. That divides, so where Ukraine divides Republicans and Democrats because Republicans have become less supportive of aid, the Democrats are more divided on U.S. support for Israel, where Republicans are very strong. And what was happening in 1982, when it was similarly this low, was that there was also conflict broke out in Lebanon, with Israel and Lebanon clashing. And we had just released the hostages from Iran in 1981, and there was the Falklands War, and it was a worldwide recession as well. And definitely the costs of Americans' perceived sense of cost of the alliance definitely contribute to their views towards whether alliances are good or bad for the United States. So all these things were going on. Another interesting thing is that Republicans, until 2015, were always the highest on this chart. So they were the really internationalist among the public. And now it's flipped. And we can talk more about that if it's of interest, but there's a lot of demographic shifts that also contribute to that. And this just, I'm not going to go into this great detail, but just that Republicans tend to think that the United States has limited resources at home and should reduce its involvement overseas. And you get a sense of this with America First sort of statements from Republican leaders that they think we should focus more inward and not so much on aiding other countries, where Democrats are divided between the two, say either the United States has a responsibility to take a leading role, or they think, well, the United States can take care of its own problems and still be involved in the world. So that's a big difference. And there's also a difference when James pointed to this one here. The one that was about the focus, I'm going to give it to you, the one that was about the focus of foreign policy. I wasn't surprised by that at all.
This one.
Yes, because Democrats, when we ask what are your goals for overall foreign policy, they say that the priority is to work with other countries to solve global problems and to protect democratic values around the world. And for Republicans, it's a much more narrow focus that they see as a goal for U.S. foreign policy. It should focus on the physical security of the country, and we should use military power to deter and respond to threats. So they're more averse to international institutions and multilateralism, where that's the core of what Democrats see as their motivation for U.S. foreign policy. So this ties right into that as well. So those were some top-level kind of background context. I have some other comments on North Korea, a little bit more differentiation on the threats between Republicans and Democrats in our data, but I don't know if you want me to discuss those now, Andy, or should I wait until we get to more points in the question? I don't want to take all the airtime.
We have plenty of airtime, and that's what we brought you here for. But I'd actually be really interested in seeing, how different threat perceptions of North Korea or differences in those perceptions inform kind of public opinion. Because here, I think, in our data, we broadly show most people are opposed to North Korea having nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. We broadly show their support for countering the threat of North Korea. Mm-hmm. But one thing that we'd really be interested in looking at is there a difference in how people perceive the threat from North Korea? Is it a threat to values? Is it a hard security threat?
So just to, I'm not,
go ahead, James. No problem.
I just want to add to what Andy was saying, and I'd like to see it as well. And the reason why I'd like to see it is because we couldn't ask that question in our survey, and largely because of two things. As you know, there are only limited number of questions we could ask, and the respondent would, with the probability that a respondent will answer that question, number one. Secondly, We wanted to keep the trend and watch the trend over the past 5 years because we accumulated enough data in the KEI data to be able to see that trend. So we couldn't really, we had limitations in terms of taking out certain questions
Yes, of course.
and introducing new questions in
Right.
their place.
And it doesn't always make sense to ask the same question year on year because there's not going to be much of a shift. And so
Right,
you
yeah,
have
so depending
limited
on,
real
right.
estate, yeah.
So, but it was my first time looking at this, so we had some restrictions in terms of being able to introduce new questions. So we couldn't ask, for instance, this kind of question. So, you know, it'd be nice to see and consider exploring these types of questions in the future if you're seeing some variations here in the data. So I'm kind of curious as well because we couldn't cover it.
Yeah, no problem. I thought I had a trend line in here already. We have asked about the threat from North Korea for a long time. So Americans are definitely negative toward North Korea, just like your findings show. But it's not necessarily a pressing foreign policy issue for Americans right now. And I say that because we ask about a long list of threats in a big battery of questions. So we ask people what's a critical threat, what's an important but not critical threat, and what's a minor threat or not a threat. So North Korea is in the kind of in the mid-tier. 52% say that North Korea's nuclear program is a critical threat to the United States. The similar percentage say that Iran's nuclear program is a critical threat. And 52. And overall, Americans usually rate limiting nuclear proliferation as a very high priority. We didn't ask that this year, but that always rates up there with international terrorism and a bunch of other important goals. But right now, Americans tend to recalibrate their sense of threat depending on what's going on in the world and what's a live issue versus what's a potentially live issue, right? So in 2017, I think the threat from North Korea jumped to 59%. And then we also saw a corresponding increase in whenever we see a big increase in a threat, then we also see in this, from North Korea, then we also see in this slide, there is a jump for the percentage who say that we should use US troops to defend South Korea. So that's when you see some of these spikes. So right now, Americans feel a little bit overstretched with we don't have boots on the ground. This isn't like Iraq and Afghanistan, but they're still feeling a bit beleaguered by the economic and military equipment assistance that we're giving to our allies. And they're also concerned about inflation economy as their number one voting issue, right? So when these things happen at the same time, Americans have to kind of recalibrate what's most important right now and what can we do and they do this, what we can do now and what we need to kind of pull back on. So that's what's happening right now in terms of North Korea. They put it along with not only Iran's nuclear program and North Korea's nuclear program, about half. Immigration is in there. Russia's territorial ambitions are in there. Also, Ukraine and the Gaza war escalating into larger wars. That's at about the same, about just over half. Iran's funding of militant groups in other countries is also at that same level. So there's a significant number of kind of second tier threats. Do you know the top threats right now, and it's because it's an election year, probably brings, Americans for many years have said internal threats are greater than external threats to the country. And this year, the top threat for both Republicans and Democrats is weakening democracy in the United States. It means different things to both of those partisans, right? But it's still a top concern. So, and then the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel itself are not as important as for the elections as economy, immigration, inflation, immigration, crime. Those are rated higher than the two wars. So I hope that answered your question about North Korea. So yeah, they definitely see North Korea as a bad actor, really unfavorable views of North Korea. However, 2/3 do say we should meet, that the United States leaders should meet and talk to North Korean leaders, which they say that about a lot of different groups that are hostile to the United States too. So and part of that is because they support diplomatic means first. That's always, even if it's sanctions and talks, we should try that first before we go to more coercive types of actions.
I think you bring up an excellent point in terms of a lot of these competing interests that U.S. foreign policy tends to face in terms of America's global reach and global influence. And actually, I think that's a perfect segue. I'd like to turn to James for a bit.
Can I make one other comment? I thought your question about if North Korea denuclearizes and that Americans say we should still keep troops there is really telling too, because China is seen, especially for Republicans, is seen as really a top threat. And I can go through what the top threats are for Democrats and Republicans later if it's interesting. But I think that is also baked into the alliance with our Pacific partners, that right now China is seen as a competitor and for some a threat. And so it's important to keep our allies in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing later on, if we have time, I would look at who you consider as critical partner. It seems in our data, South Korea and Japan kind of rated higher in some ways than our European partners, according to our data. Maybe because the challenge is greater in Asia, perhaps. But it seems from our data, what we can see, China rates just as high as Russia on a lot of these critical challenges. And North Korea is an added factor there. So what you say about what you're seeing in your data.
Yeah, it's funny. So Republicans worry a lot about China, and China's one of their top threats, along with immigration. Democrats are more concerned about Russia because of the war in Ukraine and the Democratic angle of it. But there has been growing concern among Democrats as well about China. It's hard to tease out how much of it is a military threat versus an economic threat in our data. So maybe we can work on that.
Yeah,
in future polls.
that's something. That's a point that I think Bill raised in one of the critiques as he was looking at this data. Exactly how are they perceiving these things? So yeah, something.
One of the surprising things, since we're on this slide, that I found in the data is that Trump supporters do view Russia as a critical challenge here, and yet they have been dropping off in support for aid to Ukraine. So I find that super interesting and not sure how to square that. And especially because they're going to vote for Donald Trump, and if anyone knows how Donald Trump feels about Putin, it's not quite the same as Kamala Harris does. So yeah, it's interesting to me that finding is there.
One thing that I noticed that was surprising to me was how low the number was on Ukraine, that they didn't see that as critical challenge, and the way that I interpreted that as first slide is that when they think about the issue having to do with Ukraine, they see the problem as being Russia.
Right.
More so than Ukraine itself, and
that could be what's going on there.
Right.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it's hard. So, as you know, James, and anybody who's worked with a lot of survey data knows the wording can make a big difference.
That's
and we keep things vague, like stay out of world affairs, take an active part in world affairs. That's very
Right.
Also not, and so you leave it up to the respondent to figure out what this means. So if we had more space and money in our budgets, we could ask on a range of things, which is the most, critical foreign policy economic challenge, which is the security challenge, and go on to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a perfect instrument by any means. Getting at
no one question can
no,
be.
right?
So, yeah.
But it does allow us to have a reference point, to be able to compare if there are variations and if there are any changes over time. That's what I found to be very useful. The other is, this data set is a weighted data set that consists of 1,183 data points. It's taken from close to about 2,000 samples that's been weighted down using different means. I don't know about you, but I don't know how long it would take for me to go around asking all these questions to 2,000 people and get this, in a matter of a week. But it's just a good sort of snapshot perspective into a part of how these people think about these issues. And we're getting it, instead of making, off the cuff, guesses about what the American people think based on what we're reading in the news, right? So
Exactly.
I have a deeper sense of appreciation for the data because of how much work that goes into collecting the data and making this available so that we can do these analysis. But you're right, we do have to kind of think about these as one among many data that we use to kind of get a better sense of what's actually going on.
One of the things that I find looking at the data that's been coming to mind a lot recently is that it matters so much what journalists cover in the news too, because it hasn't been a lot about North Korea at all in the past year,
That's
really.
right.
And so that also pushes down that sense of threat because they haven't heard much about it, so people think, okay, it's quiet over there, but we're certainly hearing about Gaza and Lebanon and,
So
parts of Ukraine.
before we got this data back from YouGov on September 20th. The data was collected between September 3rd to 13th. Before we got the data back, I actually did some work to see exactly what you're talking about, to see if I should actually have that
Context analysis.
right. So to see if the media coverage of this in terms of the amount of coverage and then some kind of sentiment analysis to see if it was positive or negative to kind of compare. If we do get data set that shows variations, that it will explain that. And that became a useless exercise because we just saw that there's not much change here. And it's fairly robust and still focused on Asia, even though there's a lot going on in other parts of the world. So I found this to be a little bit surprising in some ways.
No, I think those are excellent points. Especially, I kind of want to bring back, I think you added a lot more context to my original question, so I actually appreciate you interrupting me. But I think, especially in terms of the limited attention span, obviously, that the American public has for all these different things. And even when we see data where, how Americans see North Korea as a foreign policy challenge has stayed consistent, how Americans favorably view trade with South Korea is consistent. Obviously, those perceptions are going to be slightly different from the Korean side, looking at how American foreign policy affects them and how Korean publics perceive American public opinion. And I'm sorry, one of you mentioned that it's really important to have our data and, of course, Chicago Council's data is just one of many data points to help inform our overall understanding of how publics perceive it. So I was wondering, James, if you could tell us a little bit about how you saw this as someone who has a lot of experience on the Korean side and add some more color to our poll.
So, this, I'm sure Scott remembers times when working in Korea in the past where anti-Americanism was a thing. But I've looked at Korea for now and the Korean public opinions for the last 13 years, and maybe even some more, 15 years, I would say. where the data is available, and it's been consistently high support for United States and the alliance, even with, so regardless of what happens in Washington in terms of, in a given election cycle, let's say, so in 2016, when Donald Trump came in, and the expectation and the preferences leaned more Democrat. He came in, and if you take a look at all the polling data coming out of Korea, relative to other leaders around the world, Donald Trump still rated higher, almost nearly double, if not, at least 33% higher than the next closest second, which at one point was Xi Jinping. Then it became, a Japanese prime minister, depending on the year you're looking at, different leaders. And so it's been, there's not much story to tell there in terms, at least not for now. And I looked at the Gallup Korea data that they collected last month on Korean preferences about what they would like to see in the U.S. election, very similar to 2016. But I'm going to guess that relative to other countries, Koreans still value this relationship with the U.S. Because it's a sort of if you think about it, it makes sense. You have 70 years worth of history, and Korean War was an experience, obviously. But the trade relations and then the people-to-people exchanges, I think KEI is a living testament to that relationship. So I think that overall, the Korean perspective is not, I haven't seen anything that suggests anything remotely close to what we saw maybe in the 80s, 70s perhaps, and maybe even earlier part of the 90s. I just don't see that split at the moment. So regardless of what happens in a given election cycle in Korea, I think no matter who's in control of either the National Assembly or the presidential office, they would have to contend with this reality that the general public, Korean public, supports maintaining this relationship, if not strengthening it.
No, thank you for that context. And I'm just going to venture in one more question before we turn to the audience. When we look at the trade relationship and the continued support from the U.S. and how important they see trade with our partners in East Asia and Europe, we're very well aware, I think, at this point that American attitudes toward trade have changed. And I was wondering, what that support really entails. If that definition of support for trade necessarily still means the kind of free trade that we were looking at, 10, 15 years ago, or if it's a different kind of variety.
Yeah, I think it's, I'll answer it this way. So you take a look at the trade data coming out of the bilateral trade this year. Korea has consistently had a very favorable trade balance with the United States, at least on the goods trade. If you take a look, and that deficit actually has been increasing, and yet we see this support for trade, right?
We were just there.
Excuse me. Were we there?
Yeah.
Oh, is this
I
it? Yeah,
already turned
exactly.
it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
So the trade data is, it's overwhelming support. I would say that if 70% of the population is supporting that, and 25% is unsure to answer, and only 7% doesn't believe that this is beneficial to the U.S., it's not about the deficit. It's what it is. I guess, as Dina said, some of this is moving target, and how the public feels and thinks about these issues can also be influenced by the sound bites and what the leaders say about these issues. And so this, although it may not be a concern before the election, depending on the election outcome, it's something to watch for to see if there is a change in attitude about these issues because of how it's framed by the leadership. And so, yeah, I'll reserve that till after the election. But for now, I just don't see evidence here, at least. But I'm kind of curious what Dina thinks, if she's had a bit more nuanced set of questions about American attitudes on trade, and in particular, if she differentiates, American attitudes about trade with particular regions of the world.
Right, or if it's free trade,
or
if
what
it's
kind of
something like
trade,
support
right?
for investment and things
Right.
like that. Yeah.
Well, for one thing, Americans like to trade with countries they have a favorable view of, which Korea is one of them, so they don't always necessarily know details about the trade relationship, but if they feel an affinity toward a country, we usually see that they support trade with them. But you're absolutely right, Andy, so Americans have become very pro-international trade actually since Trump came into politics, because into the political scene. Before that, Republicans were not always in the majority saying that international trade is beneficial for U.S. consumers, and U.S. jobs in particular was one that they didn't think trade was great for, and the U.S. economy. But now, since Donald Trump has entered the political stage, and even when Biden took over, Republicans are really strongly supportive of trade. So that is a new trend for the last couple of years, but Americans say international trade is good for the U.S. and U.S. consumers and quality of life, but they do support a lot of restrictions and protectionist policies, and they do put the protecting U.S. workers as the top goal for U.S. foreign policy. So they do support trade restrictions on China. They do support like subsidies and assisting U.S. businesses in particularly strategic industries. So they sort of have it both ways. Yeah.
All right, well, I could keep asking for each of these slides, but I do want to turn to our audience for any questions. We will have a mic provided to you. So I saw this gentleman back here.
Hi, thanks. Scott Thompson from Samsung. Kind of an offshoot of that last question, actually. If you have any updated data and views on American thoughts on Korean investment in the United States, Korean immigration to the United States, and Korean American assimilation in the United States.
What was the last one?
Korean American assimilation in the United States once people get here.
We haven't asked about investment in a while, but James and I were just talking about it yesterday, so KEI might embark on a project to do that. Americans are very welcoming of Korean immigration to the United States. Now, immigration is a tricky issue, especially for Republicans, so if it's a high-skilled labor, low-skilled labor, we'd have to kind of test that a little bit more. But in general, it's sort of like with trade, if Americans like a country, they're willing to accept immigrants from there. And when we ask about specific groups, especially Democrats support kind of everybody, but Republicans are pretty supportive of immigration from countries that they have favorable views of. I can give you a card, and we have a lot of data on this, so we can follow up on the immigration side.
So there's some research that looks at foreign direct investment, and it's kind of interesting that you said that attitudes about trade is linked to people's views about that country and sentiments about that country. So, and a lot of the research that some political scientists have done up to this point seems to suggest, at least nationally, that this also holds for FDIs as well. What they haven't done is a sort of a more fine-tuned analysis at a local level to really compare what the magnitude of the difference is, depending on whether you've been directly impacted by these investments and you haven't. And I'll just give you a preview. That's something that KEI is interested in exploring further, And it's also something that KEI would have to discuss with the private sector, and perhaps we can talk after this, in terms of how we go about doing that. So I could imagine some survey experiments where we're looking at this question in a very interesting way, depending on the regions within a state or state across the US that have been positively or negatively affected by these investments, and then versus ones that haven't been affected at all. And I think it'll show very interesting variations and implications for both businesses and policymakers.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Fitzpatrick in the front.
Thanks very much. Mark Fitzpatrick, I'm on the board here at KEI, also Associate Fellow at IISS. Great panel, interesting data, well presented. It's reassuring. James, thanks very much for your bottom line there. It's really reassuring. It supports the view that Kim Jong-un's efforts to decouple United States from its ally, Republic of Korea, just is not working. One might think that if Americans felt vulnerable to a nuclear tipped ICBM from North Korea, they might be less willing to put U.S. troops and themselves on the line in a potential war with North Korea. But the data suggests that hasn't happened. Maybe I'm extrapolating too much, but I think it's very important. It would be important for South Koreans to know this data, because you hear so much concern in South Korea about the reliability of the U.S. deterrence, and it contributes to a desire for their own nuclear deterrence. The data doesn't support that. But I wonder how, as broad as the data is, how deep is it? Now, I'm reassured, especially, that when the threat from North Korea was seen to spike, so was the support, and the fact that these numbers are consistent over time does, maybe suggest that it is deep. But what are your thoughts on that?
It's not deep. Americans don't follow foreign policy very closely. They don't follow a lot of news very closely, but especially things that don't impact them directly. So foreign policy and alliances it's hard to describe what the benefits are. They're a little bit intangible versus you can certainly describe the cost. So that's a little bit harder for Americans. But when something does become live, like a live issue, then they will read about it and focus on it and take their cues from leaders. Now, it's a little scary to me that there's so much misinformation out there that can, run counter to U.S. foreign policy. But the fact that when things become real and on the ground, and then people react accordingly, gives me some sense of comfort in knowing that Americans will become better informed then. But they take a lot of cues from other leaders, or it could be whoever influences them most. It could be their church leader or religious leader. It could be community involvement, but there's a lot of influence there, and the media, of course.
So thanks for asking that, Mark. We didn't frame the question the way you framed it. So, and if you frame it that way, that is, as a result of North Korea having nuclear weapons, you're sending 28,500 men and women in harm's way, would you still support? I would imagine just as much as you would get a different set of response if you were to ask the Koreans, would you like an indigenous nuclear program, and here are the costs. As the costs go up, the support for that probably declines. But none of the questions that we're looking at in Korea that's coming out seems to frame it that way, right? So it is kind of coarse and crude reference point. And some of the data, though, coming out in Korea, when the prices go up, it sort of moderates, but not a whole lot. So Yes, in the future, we can ask these kinds of questions and see if there are changes. But overall, what we do know is that generally the American public has overwhelming support for the alliance relationship, and this doesn't change. If it becomes an issue, as Dina said, some of this is a moving target depending on how that issue evolves. Maybe there can be changes, but so what I'll say is that we'll have to. We don't have the kind of depth that you would like to see, unfortunately, and we need to do more. And that's where sort of additional types of analyses are helpful, not just surveys, but something that CCGA is doing a lot of that we talked about yesterday that we might consider doing is focus groups. To look at more in depth at a smaller group scale how people see some of these issues and get down to sort of a deeper understanding of these issues and push them a little on some of these questions to get their reasons for why they say what they say. For our data, one thing that we do have in our YouGov data set is that we have an oversample. And the oversample is, so we have, actually, this is a consolidation of two sets of data, 1,000 of general public, and then about 183 additional individuals that follow international news on Asia. So this is, and so we haven't dug into that more informed group, which we will be doing in future iterations that are coming out of this report to see if there are any differences there between a sort of a more informed subset of the population versus a larger sort of.
I mean, James, I'm so sorry, but I know once we get started talking about methodology, you can keep informing us all day about it, but I think, Dina, you may have one point, and then we will take one more question from our online audience before we close.
I just wanted to mention that, it's not just that the troops, here's what I want to say. A large majority of Americans support our bases overseas, not just in Asia, but also in Europe, because they see it as a way to deter threats. So that's mostly, so I don't think they're necessarily thinking we're putting them in harm's way there. I think they're thinking they're there, and that's why things have been quiet, or at least they're not hearing about it. So that's really why they support this forward presence in other countries. It's not really to use, they don't want to use the troops or deploy them, but it helps to deter any kinds of things like that. So I think, but if you framed it, it's not just that that North Korea would be able to send missiles to where the bases are in Korea, but they can also hit the United States. So again, that is a reason for Americans to support having troops in South Korea so that won't happen. So I think that's how they think of it. I did want to make just one meta observation. So like I said at the beginning, what's really powerful about U.S. attitudes toward Korea is that it's bipartisan and consistent and enduring. But what I have seen in our data toward the European alliance is a little bit telling. So I think that if something happens with Taiwan, that consistent and enduring and bipartisan support might be tested. Because when the war in Ukraine, when it first broke out, we did see Republicans in particular drop down in support, not for NATO, but saying that our alliance with European countries, more of them thought it helped the allies or nobody at all versus the United States and its allies together. So they saw less benefit for the United States when it first broke out. I think it's back to normal now. But so that it could be a little bit rocky if something happens in the region that Americans then sense a heightened sense of threat.
Right, thank you. And we are officially out of time, but just very quickly, if we could take the question from our online audience.
Okay, we have an online question from Mark Tokola. He asks, James, do Koreans and Americans agree on the reasons why they support continuing U.S. military presence in Korea. Has that changed over time? Is it North Korea, China, or something more general?
So yeah, this is the limitation of surveys that we need to augment in future iterations. We didn't explore the why, and I would think that, as Dina would say, there are various possible reasons. It just seems to be that it's very high, and so we didn't really think about, well, I didn't think about that until I saw the data set and looked at the trend over time, and this is the first year for me. And so, Mark, I think that's a great question. We will get deeper into that issue in future iterations and maybe next year's survey.
But if you do go to our full report that will be released, you'll find that there's a lot more covered there than there was presented today in this particular presentation. So we do really hope you go over to keia.org to check out our report. Thank you again to both Dina and James for joining us today. And thank you again to our in-person and online audience for participating and joining us this morning. And so we hope to see you again in another event soon. Thank you so much.